City, Nebraska, and I was following the route of Lewis and Clark as they had taken their epic journey across America from 1803 to 1806. They started in Washington, D.C., went across the country to the Pacific and back. And so they traveled in the end about 8,000 miles over this terrific, beautiful area that is now the Midwest and the Great Plains. And for those of you who have never been to the Great Plains, it takes in both of the Dakotas, eastern Montana, Nebraska, Iowa. And the grasslands, as Wayne described, are these grasses, flowers, short grass, tall grass, buffalo grass. And when you see them, it's just magnificent for miles and miles and miles. They stretch really as far as the eye can see. And I remember when Janice and I went across the West a few times, she hated the plains. She thought they were the most boring thing that there ever was, and I thought it was the most beautiful. And during the time that Lewis and Clark passed over those grasslands, they saw in sometimes herds of between 3,000 and 10,000 buffalo at one time wandering. And it was those grasslands that settlers began to populate beginning in the 1840s, and they were drawn to those grasslands and rolling hills because of the good farmland that it was. And at the time, in the Great Plains, through all of those areas, there were really very few trees out in that part of the country. There were cottonwoods and there were oaks along rivers and streams, but that was about it. And then the Nebraska resident J. Sterling Morton homesteaded there, began to plant trees on his property, and then began this notion of planting trees in all these communities. Of course, started Arbor Day. And there was this foundation that was started to promote trees and their care. It's the world's largest place where trees can be taken care of. And from that holiday there in Nebraska to here is spread across the country. And today when you travel through the Great Plains, every community is street-lined with trees. And our city is, of course, a tree city as part of that. And I remember years ago reading a book by Willa Catherine. She was from Nebraska, and she lamented the cutting down of cottonwoods in her hometown of Red Cloud, because in that time, when you got out of a community, whether it be a city or a village or a town, all of a sudden the harshness of the prairies was right back there again. And she saw that as every tree was cut down, that was not a good thing for Red Cloud. So she, like many people in the Great Plains states even today, have great affections for trees. And today, when you go to the Lead Lodge, there are thousands of trees there that have been planted, that have been shipped all over, and in fact, some of the trees that we've planted here in Port Jervis have come from Nebraska. I've always liked Arbor Day because it's the only holiday, and Dick mentioned it to some degree too, that looks to the future. Every other holiday looks backwards, but Arbor Day looks towards the front. And since we started Arbor Day all those years ago, 21 years ago, we've planted more than 330 trees here in the city of Port Jervis. And from those Arbor Days past that Dick mentioned, there were trees on East Main Street in front of the middle school. They were planted by middle school kids decades and decades ago. The East Main Street schools across from the Hackmack Graveyard, they were planted by kids long ago. And those trees remind us of people gone by who had the wisdom to plant trees, and remind us that we still have lots more to do here in our fair city. And almost half of the trees that we've planted have been by young people just like yourself, and I hope that you'll stay and help us plant afterwards. And to the parents, I apologize if they get muddy and dirty and they got to go on from somewhere, but that's all right, it's a good thing. The cherry trees behind us there, these cherry trees behind us here, we all planted on Arbor Day years ago, and those are beautiful. Those are just four beautiful, beautiful trees now. There used to be a lady named Carol Dahl who was the Trinity Catholic School principal, and every year she and I would talk here at Arbor Day. And we always talked about our favorite trees. Hers was in Michigan, in her front yard of her girlhood home. And every time she went back to Michigan, she went and climbed up the tree, or looked at it at least. And I have the same thing here in Port Jervis. My favorite tree is the large oak tree in the Hackmack Graveyard on East Main Street. It's a huge tree. It stands in the back corner of the cemetery there, graveyard. And it's the oldest tree, I'm sure, in the city of Port Jervis. And it's a magnificent white oak tree. And when our society, years ago with the city and the city historian's office and the church restored that graveyard, we marveled at the size of that tree. It was so huge. Trimmed it, took a lot of the branches, the dead branches out of it, and we hope it'll endure for another 100 years, because that tree has got to be 250 years old at that. So, and I've always thought, standing there when we've been working down that cemetery, that it's witnessed many of our country's events, the sad events of our nation's history, the happy events, the important moments. And if you drive by there today, even now, there's a British flag that flies there because that cemetery was created when we were still a British colony. And the second tree that I always think about is the tree at Fort Decker. It's on the back side of the fort, between my house and the fort. It's a Jackson white oak. It's from Athens, Georgia. And when we planted that tree, it was around the time that Lou was getting involved. It was just a small little sapling. And now it's a huge tree. And it's the only tree in the world that owns the ground, the original, not ours, the original that owns the ground that it sits on. And in 1820, when William Jackson died, he willed the tree an acre of ground and a fence around it. And so that tree died in 1942, but there's another tree that's since come up on that spot, and it's the only tree that owns itself. And when we have young people, like folks like you at our fort, they always ask me really interesting questions, like where was the bathroom in the old days? But they also ask me two questions that always strikes me as very interesting. They always ask me who somebody would sue if a branch fell out of the tree and hurt somebody. And they always want to know who pays the taxes, which our elected officials will probably have to worry about too. So today when you go home, think about your favorite tree, maybe where it is, maybe pick one here, maybe one of these beautiful cherries, maybe this beautiful maple tree out here behind us, or perhaps plant one and let that become your favorite tree. And I hope that you all have a great Arbor Day, and if you don't pick a tree, go to the one on East Main Street down there. It's a beautiful tree, and certainly after the ceremony is done, we're going to plant all these trees here today, and we'll certainly ask any of you young people, especially if you want to help us, we're delighted to have you. So thank you for all coming, and have a great Arbor Day. Thank you.